Good evening or morning or whatever time of the day it happens to be. Welcome one, welcome all to the Writer's Blick podcast. I am your host, Greg Nikas, and this week I'm sitting down with acclaimed screenwriter Billy Ray to talk about his debut novel, Burn the Water. Billy has had such an interesting career. He was the screenwriter for several big acclaimed films such as Captain Phillips, The Hunger Games. He also was the screenwriter for the AMC Nicole Kidman commercials, which we'll get into all of that in this episode of the podcast, as well as his experience on the picket line of the 2023 SAG-AFTRA strikes, how the strikes influenced the creation of this novel, Burn the Water, and so much more. If you guys are enjoying the Writer's Blick podcast, please consider leaving us a review on Spotify, Apple Podcast, YouTube, or your podcasting platform of choice. You can keep up to date with everything we're doing over on social media. We are at Writer's Blick Pod on TikTok, Instagram, and Facebook. And if you want to go the extra mile and help support the show directly, you can do so over on our Patreon. That is patreon.com/WritersBlickPod, where you can get the show one day early and help us keep the lights on while you do it. All right, guys, without further ado, let's get into today's conversation with Billy Ray. You've had such an illustrious career in writing and in directing, in media of all kinds at this point. I was most surprised, though, to learn that you were the person you're the creative visionary behind the AMC Nicole Kidman commercials at the beginning of all the movies. How does something like that end up on your desk? And just ballparking, how many times do you think you've seen that particular piece of work?
Well, that was because I was friends with Nicole and I had worked with her before, and she was contracted to do that ad and asked me for my help. They had, copies she didn't particularly like. So, just as a friend, I dove in and we never thought it was going to do what it did, of course. And I'm convinced it's because of the way they dressed her and the way her hair looks and the makeup. And I mean, they let a movie star be a movie star. The timing of it was just perfect. I don't know how many times I've seen it, but I can tell you that it is by far the most viewed thing I've ever written in my life. In movie theaters alone, it's been seen by 500 million people.
You had an initial trajectory in your career path. You went to university for journalism, and during that time period is when you discovered your passion for screenwriting. Was there a clear moment when you kind of decided to make the pivot to screenwriting over your career in journalism, or was it just kind of like that's the way the pieces landed?
No, I went to Northwestern because Medill School is the finest journalism school in the country. And I was in my first class as a freshman, which was my first journalism class, fall quarter, my freshman year, and I got a C, which is the only C I ever got in college, and it made me think that perhaps I wasn't a journalist after all. That professor really, really hated my writing and thought that it was too creative and too flowery was the word she used. And it made me think that perhaps I would be better served as a brooding dramatist than as a hard-nosed reporter.
Correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I believe I saw the first script that you sold. That was for an episode of the Jetsons? Is that correct?
First thing I ever sold was an episode of The Jetsons when I was 19. That was the summer after my sophomore year at UCLA.
What was your reaction to selling your first script, I guess, to something that was at the time such a prestigious piece of American pop culture?
Well, it was a little bit less prestigious in that it was, a cartoon. I think the people around me thought it was cute more than anything else. But what was striking about it was I showed up for the recording day and I was reading a script in the lobby before we started recording. And I said, "Who wrote this?" And they said, "You did." And I said, "What are you talking about?" And they said, "Well, we played around with your draft a little bit." And so, I'm 19 and I go into the recording booth and I start talking to the director. I go, "Okay, this is not good. This thing I just read that you're about to record, we didn't make it better by rewriting it." And all of a sudden I'm in there like battling for restoring my dialogue at age 19 on the first thing that I ever sold until the director kicked me out, kicked me out of the booth.
So many different projects under your belt as a writer. And then in 2003, or for a 2003 project, I suppose, you made the step into directing for the very first time. What was the kind of inspiration behind that pivot? And how has your experience as a director over the years influenced your style as a scriptwriter?
That was a movie called Shattered Glass. It started out as a brilliant article in Vanity Fair written by a guy named Buzz Bissinger. and I adapted it for HBO. And while I was writing the screenplay, everybody at HBO that had hired me, that entire administration, they were all fired and replaced by a new administration. And it wasn't their project. They didn't have any skin in that game. And I'm convinced that's why I write so fast now, because I'm trying to make sure that I hand the draft in to the people who hired me before they get fired. But anyway, it sat for 2 years at HBO. It just languished. And during that time, I was working on a movie where I was the writer, and I was in Prague in January outside. And I don't know if you've ever been in Prague in January, but it's cold.
I have heard
And,
rumors, yeah.
and the entire crew was freezing. We were up on a mountain in the middle of the snow. And I was sitting in a trailer, warm and cozy, as a screenwriter. And something about that felt wrong. I just thought, I'm not suffering enough for my art. I'm not standing in front of movies in the way that I want to be. And it was time to find out if I was a grown-up in that, could I direct or could I not? And Shattered Glass made a lot of sense as a directing debut because it had no gunfights. It had nothing blew up. It had no car chases or nudity or any of those craft-driven things that I knew I didn't know how to do. It was just, could you capture tone and could you capture performance? And I believed I could. So I did. And yes, once you've directed, it completely changes the way that you write. You get much more lean and much more spare, and you begin to have a much stronger sense of how much the actors and the DP and all the other craftspeople in a movie bring to a screenplay. That you really are just there to deliver the blueprint.
You had just so many successes under your belt throughout the 2000s, and then going into the 2010s, you had a couple of major moments, some acclaimed projects, some things that were just bigger moments, I guess, for the public zeitgeist in things like Captain Phillips and the Hunger Games. Was there something about projects like those specifically and the reception around those that maybe impacted you differently than others? Is there a moment you knew that these were projects hit different?
Well, I can say about Captain Phillips, the first time I saw an assembly of the movie, I knew that was a hit. It was just so clear. The way Tom's performance was working, the way Paul Greengrass had directed it, that was just a hit. You could feel it in your guts. Hunger Games, the second I read that book, I thought, this is the best idea for a movie of all time. And it remains true. It would have been hard to screw that one up.
You continued working and writing and directing and busting your butt. And then 2023, the SAG-AFTRA strikes happened. During that period, a ton of industry members began working on other projects, including yourself, as we'll get to here shortly. For someone like you, though, who had boots on the ground during the strikes, what did that moment actually feel like from the inside? And did it change the way that you think about your career or your creative future?
Well, the 2023 Writers Guild strike is the third one that I've been through. And I had also served on the board of the Writers Guild for 8 years, and I had been co-chair of our negotiating committee 3 times. So I'd been very much under the hood of guild leadership. One thing about having been through it a couple times is that you know they end, and you know that based solely on the righteousness of your cause and the reasonableness of your demands and your willingness as a guild to actually strike, you're going to get what you want. It's going to be a little less than you want, but it's going to be a lot more than the companies want to give. And if you've been through that enough times, it does calm you a little bit. I had two things going for me during that strike in 2023. One was I had been asked by Deadline, which was the magazine out here in LA, to do a podcast about it called Strike Talk. So I was doing a weekly podcast about the strike, and that kept me sane for sure. But my other job during that strike was writing this book, was writing Burn the Water. It was an idea that I had 15 years before that I'd never done as a feature or a TV show because it was such a big, expensive idea. The rule is that while you're on strike, you cannot be doing any contracted work. What you're supposed to be doing is walking around all day with a stick on your shoulder
Mhm.
in circles. And there was a lot of that, in my case, outside of 20th Century Fox. But writers write. And if you're a writer, it's impossible not to write. I had to be working on something. I could write a novel. And I took that idea and turned Burn the Water into a novel and kind of learned how to write a novel as I was going. It's a very different muscle than writing a script. The nice thing about being a writer is you can fail privately. If you are writing drafts that aren't working, no one needs to see them. And I just kept learning about how to write a novel, and eventually it started to click.
For anyone just hearing about your debut novel, Burn the Water, what can
Mhm.
you tell us about it?
It's London in 24, 25, and 90% of the city is underwater, as is 90% of the English Isle. There's no power, there are no cell phones, there's no communication with the rest of the world. We don't actually know if the rest of the world is alive or not. In this city where 90% of the water is, 90% of the city is covered by water, 10% of the land in London is livable. It's called the Dry 10, and it's being battled over by these rival gangs, the Rogues and the Crowns. The fiercest warrior in the Rogues is a captain named Rafe, and the fiercest warrior in the Crowns is a captain named Jewel. And they meet and they fall in love and expose themselves to massive levels of danger. But ultimately, they have to figure out how to save their city.
Burn the Water features a world ravaged by natural disaster, as you mentioned. There's a resource war and this timeless love story at the center of it all. When you're in the early stages of writing and you have these big concepts, in the case of Burn the Water specifically, which of these ideas came first, and how did each facet of the story evolve throughout the process?
It started with a desire to re-explore Romeo and Juliet. And I thought, what's a new way in to that classic story? Okay, what if I set it 400 years in the future? Okay, that sounds interesting. What does that future look like? What is going to be the kind of thing that would divide two rival houses like the Rogues and the Crowns, the Montagues and the Capulets? Where's the right place to set it? Okay, London, because England is an island. That sounds good. And that's a real tip of the cap to Shakespeare, which is where this whole thing started. And then you start to ask yourself, all right, what can we explore thematically in that way? And I really wanted to write about leadership. As much as Burn the Water is about love and courage, ultimately for me, it's about leadership. It's about a young woman learning what lessons going to need to integrate in order to be the person who unites an entire country.
Was YA always the intended audience for this book?
No, actually, when I started, the characters were 22, and somebody said, if they're 18, they're YA. And I realized, oh, let's do that. And I just lowered their ages. It didn't change the story at all. And it certainly didn't change the tone or the intention of the writing. I was never going to condescend because I was writing to a younger audience. I mean, the books that I loved when I was a kid, they certainly did not aim low. And they never condescended to me. I mean, I remember reading Charlie and the Chocolate Factory and Dr. Seuss and all the rest of it. And these were writers who definitely challenged me and challenged other readers like me to step up.
You play in a few different ways with messages of environmental safety throughout Burn the Water.
Mhm.
Was there a specific theme or a message that felt more urgent for you to share with an audience?
No, I really wanted to be as subtle as I could be with that one. Just the fact that London is underwater, I felt made the point. And then it just becomes a massive complication that my leads have to deal with. And I felt that the reader could draw their own conclusion about how we got there.
The love story at the center of it, you said, is very Romeo and Juliet inspired, and that certainly comes across throughout the page. What was your inspiration, besides the obvious inspiration, for the factions of the Rogues and the Crowns?
Well, it all came out of Shakespeare. It all came out of Romeo and Juliet. What would the Montagues and the Capulets be like 400 years from now? What would they be fighting over? And the idea that they were fighting over patches of land seemed really appealing to me. And then what would that fight look like? And then it became, okay, so they'd have knives, they'd have swords, they'd have bows and arrows, they'd have maces and clubs. It would all be that up close, really horrible, violent stuff. But then I thought, guns wouldn't go away. It's just the machinery to create bullets would go away because there's no power. And so if you had a world where guns had survived 400 years, but everything that they put in those guns, the ammunition, had to be melted down metal that was turned into these things called sluggers, which are sort of mini balls. That seemed like fun too, because then you'd say, okay, everybody goes into the army at 12 years old, but everybody lower than 12 is a rover. They're just out there scrounging around London trying to find anything that was made of metal. So a world with no metal, stripped down cars, stripped down buses, they're all gone because they've all been turned into bullets. And that seemed like a really sad, but I thought important commentary too.
I know it's very early days, but in your mind, is there a path? I know you've kind of talked about how difficult it was to try and adapt Burn the Water to get the story
Mhm.
made for the screen. But now that it's a book, do you see a way forward for it to get to the big screen? And if so, how involved would you like to be with that process?
I will be very disappointed if this doesn't wind up on the screen. It was always thought of in those terms, and you know, my entire career has been made by the movies, and my entire childhood before that. So yes, this has always been intended to be not just a movie, but the beginning of a trilogy. And those conversations are already beginning out here. And the second book has already been written. When I sold the first one to Scholastic, it was a two-book deal. And so that second book will be published a year from now. And I'm hoping that if we find the audience that we want, that it'll make it a lot easier to launch this as a movie franchise.
Definitely fingers crossed because it was a very fun read. As fun as a story with such heavy theming can be, I suppose. I guess wrapping up, I only had one other question for you. Is there a project in all of the projects you've worked on that, in your opinion, is criminally underrated? Or maybe one that nobody ever asks about that you wish that they would?
Yeah, for me, it's the movie Richard Jewell, that Clint Eastwood directed. That one got caught in some really unfair controversy right before its release that turned out to be untrue, and it hurt the release of the movie. But I'm enormously proud of that movie, and I wish it had not been encumbered by press elements that I think were designed to hurt the movie and did.
Billy, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today. For anyone who's curious about your work or Burn the Water, where can they go for more information?
Well, first of all, you can buy the book in any bookstore, and I hope you will. You can buy it online. There's a million ways to do that. There's also an Audible from Scholastic. You can go to the Scholastic Books website. You can follow me on Twitter, which I refuse to call X, at BillyRay5229. I'm also on Blue Sky, and you'll find out all kinds of updates about where I'm going, and there's a sort of a mini book tour that's coming, and I'll be all over the place talking about this book because I'm really, really proud of it.
Thank you, Billy, so much for joining us on this episode of the podcast. Guys, please show him some love and go check out Burn the Water, available now wherever books are sold. Next week on the Writer's Block podcast, I am sitting down with children's author Jasmine Warga to talk about her latest book, The Unlikely Tale of Chase and Finnegan.
He's brought to the zoo where he meets Chase, who has been struggling herself. She's the only cheetah left in the cheetah program, and she feels so much pressure. She's really feeling anxious about it. She's not sure she's going to be what the zoo wants. And Finnegan learns that his job is going to be to try to be Chase's friend. But he's not really sure what that means. What does it mean to be a friend? How do you support Chase? But as the story goes on, we start to realize that maybe Finnegan needs Chase as much as Chase needs Finnegan. And it's really a book about what does it mean to be vulnerable? What does it mean to open up to someone? What does it mean to be willing to be honest? And sometimes we have to be honest about the things that make us feel insecure and vulnerable in order to really get the support that we need.
If you're enjoying the Writer's Block podcast, please consider leaving us a review on Spotify, Apple Podcast, YouTube, or your podcasting platform of choice. You can keep up to date with everything we're doing over on social media. We are at Writer's Block Pod on TikTok, Instagram, and Facebook. And if you want to support the show directly, you can head over to patreon.com/writersblockpod, where you can get early access to every episode of the podcast and help us keep the lights on. One final time, thank you so much to Billy Ray for joining us on this week's episode of the podcast. Thank all of you for sticking around to the bitter end. Bitter end? Is it a bitter ending? Do I make this bitter for you guys? I'm a monster. Until next time, I've been Greg, you've been awesome, and keep writing.